And now we have Avi Melamed, an Israeli analyst and author of Inside the Middle East. Avi, thanks for being here. So, to start, if you wouldn't mind, maybe just explain to our viewers who you are, what you do, how did you get involved in this work?
Sure. So my name is Avi Melamed. I'm a former Israeli intelligence official and senior official on Arab affairs. I'm the founder of Inside the Middle East, a nonprofit institute providing apolitical, nonpartisan education about the Middle East.
Okay, so we're obviously recording on the anniversary of the October 7 terror attack that obviously caught a lot of people off guard when it happened and with the unfolding events. With everything you see in the Middle East, obviously Israel's been fighting Hamas, fighting Hezbollah for a long, long time. But aside from the obvious effects of an actual war, how has this changed the equation of how Israel deals with its terror threats, how the radical Islamist world has been dealing with Israel, etc.?
Well, look, this whole attack, October 7, and everything that happens following up until today, as you mentioned accurately, Israel is fighting against different challenges from different regions in different levels of intensity. It's actually not a surprise for people like myself who have been professionally following the events in the region, in the Middle East for many decades. And to a large extent, you could say that it was written on the wall. This is what we see today is almost inevitable because the Iranian regime in Tehran basically was unfortunately able to create this network of armies of terror called the Axis of Resistance across the Middle East and to dictate to a large extent the trajectory of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict negatively, but also at the same time to inflict disaster and havoc across the Middle East, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, and so on. So right now, what we are looking at is that this building threat on the state of Israel, but not only on the threat of the state of Israel has now been reached to the point where it's kind of like exploded. And Israel is now engaged, as you say, in fighting in the proxies of the Iranians and the Iranians themselves, who, reminding you, launched twice during that year direct attack on Israel on April 13 and October 1st.
As you mentioned with the Axis for Resistance, the I guess you could say the proxy that everybody has their minds on right now is Hezbollah and everything that is going on in Israel's north. It seems like every day there's a new development with some high commander being assassinated or a new invasion. In your book, Inside the Middle East, Entering a New Era, which I actually have a copy of here, you wrote about pre 2021 Lebanon and some of the problems they had. This is just a quote that you wrote in there. However, as the crisis in Lebanon deepens, there is a genuine possibility that massive violence will erupt in Lebanon and the country will just be dragged into complete havoc. The fear of this scenario is palpable, and this is something that all elements in Lebanon, including Hezbollah, want to avoid. Now, back then, of course, Hezbollah was still very much in control of Lebanon. It was still probably arguably the most feared of Iran's proxies. With the recent developments, that's all come into question. Do you think that with what Israel is doing right now, a scenario just like that could happen?
But look, unless the Hezbollah was launching October 8th, starting to attack Israel by the order of the Iranians, we may have been in a different place today. But the Hezbollah basically cornered himself when the leader of Hezbollah, Nasrallah, said following October 7, he said, I'm going to attack Israel until there will be ceasefire in Gaza Strip. And so there hasn't been a ceasefire in Gaza Strip, and Hezbollah continued to poke Israel, sort of speaking. And that process has been intensifying, basically leading right now to the point where the Hezbollah is in a place that it did not anticipate it and, of course, didn't look for in October 6th, because up until not so long ago, Hezbollah was positioning itself as a regional power. And to a large extent, accurately, Hezbollah not only took Lebanon hostage, Hezbollah is involved in the war in Yemen. He's involved in the war in Syria. He's involved in what's happening in the West Sahara. And the leaders of Hezbollah did not even try to conceal that. They were bragging about it. And the Hezbollah was building itself as an image of an invincible or undefeated factor in the region. Now he's in a totally different place and embrace that, to a large extent, the Hezbollah in its worst nightmares did not anticipate a year ago. And one of the interesting things that we see today in the context of Lebanon, you quoted from the book, is that in fact now many of the Lebanese, including by the way many Shiites, which is the political power base of Hezbollah, many of Lebanese are basically saying this is our window of opportunity to restore our stolen or kidnapped sovereignty because Hezbollah kidnapped Lebanon or took Lebanon hostage. And so it's very interesting to see how that dynamic will evolve in the year to come, following what happened to Hezbollah and following to what will be the outcome of this whole regional tensions and escalation. But right there, as we talk about Lebanon today, I would say that this is for the first time, and the Lebanese know that. This is for the first time for the last couple of decades that Lebanese says they really have a chance to finally get back their homeland and restore their sovereignty. That has to do a lot of that has to do also with the position of Western powers, to what extent they will be standing by the Lebanese people to restore their sovereignty. All I can say in that regard is one simple thing. If the Lebanese will be able to restore that sovereignty, that's a good news to Lebanon. It's a good news to Israel. It's a good news to the region.
Now, with everything happening in Lebanon, with Israel moving in, I think a lot of people were taken aback by how little resistance Hezbollah has been pushing back. I mean, the Israeli Air Force had already taken out, by some estimates, half of Hezbollah's rocket arsenal, but that still leaves tens of thousands of rockets that they could have used, but they haven't, even though at this point it seems like they have nothing left to lose. Why is Hezbollah dragging its feet so much?
Well, look, there are a couple of reasons. First, starting from a tactical, I would say Hezbollah has been severely beaten, and particularly the impact of the deep Israeli infiltration to Hezbollah's most kept secret assets, like the depots of the missiles, the whereabouts of its leadership. Israel took out all of the leadership of Hezbollah, literally speaking, including the Hassan Nasrallah. The impact of all those things are enormous in different aspects. Obviously, we all remember what happened with the story of the pagers attacks. So all those things, accumulatively speaking, basically shocked the Hezbollah. Though it's kind of like starting to try to get back to itself and to regain structure, it's still a very challenging task, particularly when Israel continues its strikes at Hezbollah. Now, you have mentioned accurately that Hezbollah still has, of course, significant capacities and probably will continue and try to continue part of those capacities. There is another part of his capacities, which is, of course, the long-range missiles that the Hezbollah has, which he's not using, because the Iranians don't give him the green light, sort of speaking, to use that. The fate of the Hezbollah, in the end of the day, to a large extent, is related, of course, with the story of the Iranian regime. And right now, the Iranian regime, as the whole world is kind of like bracing for what is supposed to be an upcoming Israeli response to the Iranian attack on Israel on October 1st. Obviously, everybody is looking to see what will be the response, assuming there is going to be a response, because Israeli government formally said there is going to be a robust response. So what will be the outcome of that response? What will be the Iranian response to the response? So all these things are, of course, connected. And of course, one of the things that is very significant in that context is what will be the ramifications in the context of the Hezbollah continuation, as you mentioned before, to resist, quote unquote. I can tell you by now that in Hezbollah's people overtly are basically saying we don't object ceasefire. which kind of like indicates, of course, I would say the interest of the organization and the interest of the Iranians to avoid further strikes, because every day that goes by, the Hezbollah is losing more and more assets. And in parallel to that, the voices in Lebanon demanding to restore the sovereignty, those voices are being boosted and encouraged and strengthened. And for Iran and Hezbollah, the situation of Hezbollah losing its ability to continue and control Lebanon, as it has been doing for the last couple of decades, for Iran and Hezbollah, this is a bad news. So they have to navigate between those two things.
You mentioned what a lot of the Lebanese people are feeling with this. Obviously, Lebanon has had a long history of sectarian war and religious divisions, especially. One of the aspects of this that at least surprised me the most is how quiet the Lebanese forces and Samir Jaja have been with everything going on. At least from what I've seen, he seems to be more saying an attack on Lebanon and his attack on all, etc., even though they'd be the ones to benefit, arguably most if Hezbollah would be to uproot it from power. What is the Maronite Catholic response or view in this?
Well, look, as I mentioned before, it's not a surprise. Before this whole situation, already back in what is known as the Cedar Revolution back in 2019, when Lebanese went out to the streets, actually demanding to restore their sovereignty, actually demanding Hezbollah to disarm itself, which of course back then was totally hopeless. Um, so obviously the Lebanese forces, so as they know, the Christian particular, when you talk about, were of course major component in this protest. But at the same time, we have to remember that the national stream, the national party, under the leadership of Aoun back then, the president of France and his son-in-law, Gibran Basir, they actually handed over Lebanon to the hands of the Hezbollah. They legitimized the weapon of the Hezbollah in return for the Hezbollah's consent that Aoun will be the president of Lebanon. But the interesting thing to note is, you mentioned before Samir Jaja. Samir Jaja not so recently made a public statements and very, very fiery rhetoric and speech, basically saying what people in the Cedar revolution were saying, basically saying to Hezbollah, you cannot dictate your will without consulting the rest of the Lebanese. You have to be playing ball with the other Lebanese. You can't just decide whenever you want to have war or peace, which of course reflect this rejection or opposition to Hezbollah. But I think there is nothing not less significant to notion right now, and that is the fact that it's not only within the Christians and Maronites, Druze and Sunnis, but also within the Shiites themselves in Lebanon. There is now also growing voices in the leadership level of the Lebanese Shiites, who actually says to Hezbollah, it's time to end this thing because you dragged us to havoc and destruction. It's time to end it. It's time for you, Hezbollah, to be part of the state of Lebanon and not to be the destructor of the state of Lebanon. And this is very significant. It's coming from the Shiite circles in Lebanon themselves, including senior leaders, which, by the way, one of the most outspoken critics of the Hezbollah is the former Secretary General of Hezbollah, Subhi Tfaili, that constantly basically bashed and lashed Hezbollah for dragging Lebanon to this war against the will of the Lebanese people. So it will be very interesting to see what will be the ramifications of that in the context of the hope that Lebanon will be able to restore its sovereignty.
And now with Israel moving into southern Lebanon, their, or at least the IDF's stated goals are to neutralize the threat that, for obvious reasons, Hezbollah poses on the northern border, to get rid of Hezbollah's infrastructure on the border that's hurting the communities, that's forcing the 60,000 Israelis to be refugees in their own homes. But by this point, with, again, how much of a response Hezbollah has given, it seems that at least the IDF would have an opportunity to move further north and perhaps finish Hezbollah off once and for all. Is that a likely scenario?
I don't think so. Look, Israel wants to secure the northern communities of Israel. The threat to the northern communities of Israel is basically, of course, when you look at the northern part, it's coming from Hezbollah, and it has two major aspects. One is the rocket shooting, and the other thing, which is the anti-tank missiles that the Hezbollah has been using and can use. And Israel needs to remove that threat so people could go back safely to their homes. People will not go back safely to their home knowing that you got Radwan forces of the Hezbollah sitting in proximity to the border, waiting for the sign to storm Israel style October 7. And Israelis will not go back to the border to live in their communities in the north, knowing that Hezbollah is sitting in the next by Lebanese villages and pointing them with an anti-tank missiles that could hit a bus taking kids to school. So Israel is determined to basically eliminate those two major elements of threat, meaning the Radwan forces presence next to the border and the anti-tank missiles. I don't think that Israel is going to hunt the last rockets in the hands of Hezbollah, and I don't think that Israel will hunt necessarily the missiles, the long-term missiles, the long-range missiles. I think that Israel basically focus on clearing this whole strip in proximity to the Israeli border, making sure that the threat of missiles, of anti-tank missiles, and the threat of Radwan forces is removed. And if Hezbollah will insist to continue and to shoot rockets and so on, Israel will continue to degrade more and more assets of the Hezbollah, like, for example, what Israel has been doing in the Dahia, in the southern part of Beirut, attacking major depot of weapons and missiles of the Hezbollah that were stored in the heart of Beirut, and elsewhere, like in Bekaa, in the eastern part of Lebanon. But Israel's, I think, major objective, as I said before, is to remove the threat of the Radwan forces next to the border and the threat of the anti-tank missiles.
Okay, shifting gears a little bit. Obviously, Hezbollah is not the only uh, tentacle of the octopus, the Iranian octopus, you could say. There's also Syria right next door, which is obviously a big supporter of Hezbollah as well. To this point, Bashar Assad has been really dragging his feet into entering the conflict, even though Hezbollah has such a big presence in Syria, even though he is the corridor for Iran geographically to get to Hezbollah. Obviously, he has a lot of problems of his own, but Israel, of course, famously last month conducted a high profile raid in northern Syria. It's looking more and more that Assad isn't able to keep his hands out of the conflict one way or another. Where do you see Syria going in the future with everything going on?
Well, it's very interesting. You accurately mentioned it. Assad kept totally silent about what's going on with Hezbollah. And as you mentioned, given the fact that Hezbollah is one of the major reasons why Assad still is in power, you would expect Assad to come forward and, to be overtly supporting Hezbollah. And he didn't even express condolences over the killing of Nasrallah, to the best of my knowledge. So there is, of course, reasons for that. There are reasons for that. Look, one thing that has been very clear was that Assad was not willing and doesn't want to be dragged into a wide conflict in Israel because apparently understands that that may be resulting in the end of its rule. So this is one thing. But I think that also there has been accumulative information in the last year indicating that Assad is looking for ways to a little bit loosen, sort of speaking, the Iranian hug. So he's kind of like in between, dependent on the Iranians on one hand, and on the other hand, there is some sort of an interest of Assad maybe to loosen a little bit this Iranian hug. Part of that, by the way, is fueled, I think, by sentiments of resentment and discontent among the Alawites in Syria who are not so happy with the presence of the Iranians in parts of their areas. I think this is one of the things that fuels this Assad, sort of like intention to kind of like move away a little bit from the Iranian hug. Also, in the background of those things, of course, is the whole Arab rapprochement that was given, Arab rehabilitation that was given formally to Assad when he participated in the Arab League and was welcomed back to the Arab world. But up until now, that rehabilitation was not translated into the massive investments that Assad was hoping to see coming from Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. One other thing which is very interesting to notice in the context of what's going on right now in Syria is that in parallel to the massive blow that Hezbollah sustained, the Free Syrian Army kind of like starting again to reappear, sort of speaking, and also other factors of the rebels that actually are kind of like probably looking at it as a moment of momentum for them. And then there is another significant component that we have to follow, and this is, of course, Turkey, and to see what will be the ramifications of that in the context of the relationship between Erdogan and Assad, which has been kind of like going up and down during the last couple of years. So it will be very interesting to see how things will evolve in Syria. Clearly, the Iranians are trying to maintain and even increase their presence and hold in Syria. So it will be very interesting to see what will be down the road the ramification of what is now clearly the weakening of the Hezbollah and in parallel to that, the weakening of the Mullah regime.
Yes, you mentioned in your book that this is another quote. The linchpin of this Iranian ecosystem is Iran's agents and proxies. They are also the Achilles heel of the mullah's hegemonic endeavor. And you said later that the most vital link in this ecosystem of proxies is Syria. It looks very likely that Hezbollah, at the very least, would be having some restructuring coming up, if not outright revolution in Lebanon, as you mentioned. You mentioned that Assad has been trying to loosen the hug. If Hezbollah loses its power and authority, that would probably be an impetus for that. With how Iran has been responding to the ongoing war, it's mainly been trying to keep up its relationship as head of the axis of resistance, to send missiles across the Arabian Peninsula to attack Israel directly. But if they're, through different circumstances, we could see Lebanon and or Syria start, because of the war, to break away from Iran's grip, do you think we might see more active Iranian involvement in trying to clean up the damage?
It's an open question. I mean, to a large extent, it depends upon the Western powers' position. And I do hope that this whole year and all these dramatic events, once and for all, will make the Western policymakers, I wouldn't say internalize, because I think they knew, Western policymakers knew about the threat the Iranians are presenting. But I hope that it will kind of like once and for all, make the Western policymakers to apply much more decisive, non-compromising, and even tough policy vis-a-vis the story of the threat that the Mullah regime is presenting to the region. It is to a large extent, what we see right now is a window of opportunity to generate a significant change in the very unstable reality of the Middle East that, to a large extent, and particularly when you're talking about Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Gaza, was dictated by the Iranians and the axis of proxies. This is a moment of opportunity to change that course and to start building conditions for a much more stable reality and conditions on the ground. But it requires a very clear, decisive, non-compromising Western powers policy vis-a-vis the Iranian regime, vis-a-vis the threat that it presents. I mean, global economy has been significantly damaged following the attacks of Houthis in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. So this is the time also for Western powers to step in and to really take much more robust, decisive actions and decisions vis-a-vis the Iranians, basically to manifest the fact that this is a moment of change. The game rules are now changed, and this is the moment to start moving towards, hopefully, more stable reality on the ground. But this is an open question. I wish I could say decisively that I think that is going to happen. I don't know to say that necessarily. We'll have to see how things will evolve.
Who do you think would be most likely as a country or a group of countries to come in and step and say help Hezbollah out or reconstruct Lebanon or Syria or anything like that?
Well, look, the Iranian regime clearly will try to restore as much as possible, as quickly as possible, its control over Lebanon through the Hezbollah and also its ability to continue to dictate the fueling the flames of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because this is the interest of the Iranian regime. So, as far as the Iranian regime is concerned, it's definitely expected that it will try to do all those things to rebuild quickly as possible Hezbollah, and Hamas, and others. And that's exactly the point where we talked about the Western powers and the need for them to come in between and to make sure that it's not going to happen.
Well, I meant more if, say, if there was a revolution and say Lebanon starts looking for foreign backers, like, do you think they would ask the EU to maybe come and get involved, or Turkey, or some other group like that?
Look, if you're looking at a scenario of an inner Lebanese power struggle, violent power struggle, you could you could of course take into consideration the involvement of outer powers. Turkey is definitely one possible option because there is a large Sunni population in the northern part of Lebanon, even though I'm not so sure that Turkey will rush to deal with this hot potato. But this is one example. We have to think about involvement of Western powers like France, that has a very long, deep connections to Lebanon, and particularly the Christians in Lebanon. The United States. In other words, if there would be such a scenario, that would be a moment of test for the decisiveness of Western powers to open a new page in the story of the region, in the sense that not allowing Iran to continue and to dictate the fate and trajectory of the region. And so potentially, yes, we could see, of course, a situation where such powers would be involved. I don't necessarily see the Iranians directly involved in such a scenario to save Hezbollah. They will try, of course, other ways to put handles of pressures different ways, not necessarily in Lebanon, but elsewhere. They will apply probably the same tactic that they have been applying to try to save Hamas following October 7 by activating their different proxies in different parts of the region. But the Iranian regime has a very significant feature, and that is that the Iranian regime has been very gladly sacrificing everybody else other than the Iranians themselves. So I don't see necessarily that this feature is going to be changed.
One last question. With an uptick in unrest in the area, speaking of Europe, of what's probably on a lot of people's minds is that if Lebanon or Syria or some of these other areas in the north were to become more volatile, more active fighting, there's a chance that the refugee crisis could uptick again, and we could start seeing hundreds of thousands of refugees heading north to Europe again. Do you think that could play any role with how Europe responds or how the West responds?
You're talking about the Syrian refugees?
Well, Syrian refugees or Lebanese refugees, if there's any fighting in there, like there would obviously be a large uptick in people that would be trying to get out of there. And with Europe being on the back door, Turkey as well, that would be a natural option for a lot of people to gravitate to.
Yes, of course. I mean, look, already we know that there is a significant impact of the story of the refugees. You mentioned accurately Turkey, where, and by the way, right now, there has been reports about, I don't know to say the numbers, estimated by thousands. I don't know to say if it's accurate or not, but reports about many Syrian refugees that were in Lebanon that now flee to the northern part of Syria in the areas that are controlled by the Turkish-backed rebels. And it's possible that the next thing they will do will be to knock down on the doors of Turkey, which I don't know to say that Turkey necessarily will open the door, sort of speaking. But also not less significant is to remind ourselves that as you mentioned before, we know that Jordan has been dealing with a massive challenge of the Syrian refugees. I don't know to say whether there is going to be an inflation of that challenge. This is one possible scenario that we'll also have to take into consideration. Um, so definitely, I mean, in such scenario of like a totally fresh match, sort of speaking of all the cards, we could expect also that the issue of refugees will become a major factor that basically involve in the shaping of this new strategic or geostrategic landscape of the region, and particularly when you talk about the whole complex of Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, as you mentioned earlier.
Avi Melamed, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me. Have a good day.